The cafe was quiet, except for the distant hum of city life outside. The neon lights flickered dimly, casting a dull glow over the nearly empty restaurant. It wasn't a high-end place, nor was it particularly well-known. Just a simple family-run cafe tucked away in a narrow Parisian street. Behind the counter, Naomi wiped down the glass display case with slow, tired movements. The day had been long, filled with the usual hustle of serving customers, handling impatient orders and forcing polite smiles even when exhaustion tugged at her limbs. But she wasn't complaining. This job was everything to her. It paid the rent, put food on the table, and gave her enough to send a little extra home to her mother, who was still in Marseille. She had worked here for 3 years, clocking in long hours to keep her position. She wasn't going to mess this up. The soft chime of the entrance bell made her glance up. It was close to midnight, an odd time for customers, considering the cafe usually slowed down by now. Her eyes landed on 3 teenage boys, dressed in slightly worn-out athletic tracksuits. Their sneakers were scuffed, their expressions tired but alert. One of them, slightly shorter than the others, kept his hood up, as if trying not to be noticed. They looked young, hungry. Naomi had seen kids like them before. Street kids, struggling athletes, young dreamers, with nothing but hope and a few coins in their pockets. She had been one of them once. She forced a warm smile as they hesitantly approached the counter. "Bonsoir, boys. What can I get you?" The boy in the hoodie avoided eye contact, his fingers gripping the few crumpled bills in his hands. He started, then cleared his throat. "What's the cheapest thing you got?" Naomi's heart sank. They weren't just hungry. They were calculating how little they could spend while still filling their stomachs. She glanced at the owner, Mr. Lambert, who stood a few feet away, busy tallying receipts. He hadn't noticed them yet. Quickly, she leaned forward and whispered, "How about I make you something special? Just sit down, I'll take care of it." The boy's head snapped up. "But, we don't have enough." "I didn't ask that," Naomi said softly. "Just sit." For a moment, he didn't move. Then, cautiously, he nodded. The 3 boys shuffled toward a small table in the corner, looking almost out of place, as if they didn't belong in a place where people actually serve them. Naomi worked quickly, assembling 3 plates of warm food. She didn't skimp on portions. If they were going to eat, they were going to eat well. She slid the plates in front of them, watching as their eyes widened. "Eat," she said simply. The hooded boy looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw his face clearly. There was something familiar about him. His sharp features, his intense gaze, the way he carried himself. She had seen him before, but she didn't dwell on it. She simply smiled and turned away. And that's when everything went wrong. A cruel reality. Mr. Lambert's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Naomi!" She froze mid-step, heart hammering in her chest. Slowly, she turned to see him marching toward her, his face twisted in fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his voice low but sharp. She swallowed hard. "I was just—" "You gave them free food," he cut her off. Naomi's stomach dropped. They were hungry. "That's not your decision to make," Lambert snapped. "This is a business, Naomi. We don't give handouts." She clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay calm. "It was just one meal. It doesn't cost that much, and they—" "I don't care," Lambert hissed, his face red with anger. Naomi glanced at the boys who had stopped eating. Their expressions were tight, unreadable. The hooded one, the one who looked oddly familiar, had his fists clenched under the table. Lambert turned back to Naomi, his lips curling in disgust. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he sneered. "You think you're saving the world one plate at a time?" Naomi didn't answer. She just stood her ground. Lambert shook his head. "You're fired." Naomi's breath hitched. "What?" "You heard me." Lambert folded his arms. "You're done here." Her mind spun. She couldn't lose this job. She needed this job. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking. I need this. Lambert didn't even flinch. You should have thought of that before playing charity worker. Naomi felt like the ground had been ripped from under her. She looked at the boys, humiliated that they had to witness this. The hooded one, the one with the familiar face, stood up slowly. His expression was unreadable, but there was something cold and sharp in his eyes. Naomi didn't wait for any more insults. She untied her apron, placed it on the counter, and walked toward the door. But just before she stepped out, she heard the hooded boy's low, steady voice. You'll regret this. Lambert laughed. Oh, sure, I'm shaking, he said mockingly. The boy said nothing, just stared. And Naomi, though she didn't fully understand it yet, knew she had just witnessed something important, something that wasn't over yet. Years later, the cafe had changed. The once familiar neon sign was replaced with something sleeker. The once worn-out chairs were now high-end furnishing. And the name above the entrance? It was different now. The doors swung open, and the air buzzed with the hum of customers, clinking glasses, and low laughter. At the back of the cafe, a woman sat alone. Naomi eyed. She had aged, but not in a bad way. She looked stronger, wiser eyed, but still carrying the scars of that night. The night she had lost everything. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, watching the cafe that had once been hers to serve in. She had no idea why she had come back. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the need to face the past. Or maybe it was fate. Because as she sat there, the doors swung open again. And this time the entire cafe went silent. A man stepped inside. Tall, confident, a face everyone knew. Kylian Mbappé. Her breath caught in her throat. Because suddenly, it all clicked. The hooded boy. The one she had fed that night. The one who had whispered, "You'll regret this." It had been him. Now he wasn't a hungry teenager anymore. He was one of the most famous athletes in the world. And he had just walked back into the cafe where it had all begun. The weight of the moment pressed against Naomi's chest. She sat frozen in her seat, fingers tightening around her coffee cup, as Kylian Mbappé stepped further into the cafe. He was different now. The once quiet, hungry teenager was now a global icon. The cafe's customers whispered excitedly, some already reaching for their phones. A few muttered his name in disbelief, unsure if they were seeing correctly. Mbappé barely seemed to notice. His sharp eyes scanned the room, but not in the way most celebrities would. There was no nervousness, no rush to leave before being swarmed. Instead, he moved with purpose, like a man who had unfinished business. Then his gaze locked onto Naomi. A beat passed. She saw recognition flicker in his eyes, and suddenly he was walking straight toward her. Naomi's heart pounded. A reunion years in the making. She couldn't move. Her breath came in short, shaky bursts as Kylian approached her table, his presence commanding yet oddly familiar. When he finally stood in front of her, there was no hesitation. Bonsoir, madame. His voice was calm, steady. Naomi felt a lump form in her throat. It had been years since anyone had called her that with respect. For a long time, she had been just another struggling worker. Now she was sitting across from one of the most powerful men in sports. And she still didn't know why. Kylian pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Do you remember me? He asked, tilting his head slightly. Naomi let out a soft, breathy laugh. You're not exactly easy to forget, Kylian. A small smile tugged at his lips. But, she continued, her expression softening, I remembered you even before you became all this. She gestured vaguely around them, as if trying to capture the magnitude of his success. I just didn't know it at the time. Kylian nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. You fed me that night, he murmured. Naomi swallowed hard. Yes, she admitted. You and your friends. You looked like you needed it. Killian leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "That was the night I almost gave up," he said quietly. Naomi's stomach dropped. "What?" Killian exhaled, his gaze distant for a moment. "I was 16, he said. I had just moved to Monaco. I had no family there. I trained all day, barely had money for food, and I was starting to wonder if it was worth it." He met her gaze again. "And then you fed me." Naomi's throat tightened. She had never known, never imagined that a simple meal had meant so much to him. "It was just food," she whispered. Killian smiled faintly. "No," he said. "It was hope. The truth comes out." Before Naomi could fully process his words, Killian glanced toward the counter. His expression darkened. "I see the place has changed," he murmured. Naomi followed his gaze. The sleek countertops, the updated decor, the new name above the entrance. "Yes," she said. "The original owner sold it a few years ago. I guess the place wasn't doing as well after he fired me." Killian's jaw tightened. "That's why I'm here," he said. Naomi frowned. "What do you mean?" Killian leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I bought it," he said simply. Naomi's breath caught. Her pulse hammered in her ears. For a second she thought she had misheard him. "You bought it?" Killian nodded. Naomi's chest tightened. I don't understand," she stammered. "Why would you do that?" Killian tilted his head as if amused by the question. "Because I made a promise," he said. Naomi blinked, confused. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small and folded. "A napkin?" He placed it on the table between them and slowly unfolded it. Naomi's breath hitched. It was old, slightly crumpled, but the words written across it were still clear. "One day when you're famous, don't forget me." Naomi covered her mouth with her hands. She had written that message jokingly all those years ago, never expecting that it would mean anything, never expecting that he would keep it. Killian's voice was calm but firm. "I don't break my promises." Naomi's eyes filled with tears. And for the first time in years, she felt seen. "A new beginning." Naomi wiped at her eyes, shaking her head in disbelief. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Killian smiled. "Say yes." Her brow furrowed. "Yes to what?" "To running this place." She stared at him. Disbelief, shock, and then hope. Killian chuckled at her expression. "It's yours, Naomi, if you want it." Naomi felt like she couldn't breathe. For years she had worked herself to exhaustion for jobs that barely paid enough to survive. Now she was being handed the chance of a lifetime, to run her own cafe, to build something new, something better, something where no one would ever be turned away again. Tears welled in her eyes. She reached across the table, squeezing Killian's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. He smiled. "No, thank you." The weight of Killian's words settled over Naomi like a blanket she never expected to have. It was real. He was offering her everything she had once lost, and more. For years she had struggled just to make ends meet. Now, the very place where she had been fired in disgrace was hers to rebuild. She stared down at the napkin he had saved for so many years, running her fingers over the faint ink. A shaky laugh escaped her lips. "I was joking when I wrote that, you know." Killian smirked. "I wasn't?" Naomi let out a breath. "How was this happening? How do you even know I can run a business?" she asked, half laughing, half crying. "I was just a waitress." Killian shook his head. "You were never just a waitress." Something about the way he said it made her throat tighten. "You cared about people," Killian continued. "You saw 3 hungry kids and didn't turn us away. You gave us food dignity when no one else would. That's the kind of person who deserves to be in charge." Naomi swallowed past the lump in her throat. "But I don't know how to run a restaurant. I don't have experience managing anything." Killian chuckled. "Neither did I when I started playing football professionally." She gave him a look and he grinned. "All right, bad example," he admitted. "But you don't have to do this alone, Naomi. I'll set you up with the best people. You'll have a team to help you get started. All you have to do is say yes." Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. For years she had worked under people who never appreciated her. For years she had accepted whatever job she could find, knowing that one wrong move could leave her with nothing. But now, she had a chance to take control, to create something new. Her hands trembled as she reached for the set of keys Killian had placed on the table. When she gripped them, something inside her clicked into place. "Yes," she whispered. Killian's smile widened. "Good," he said, "because I already changed the name on the ownership papers." Naomi laughed through her tears, shaking her head. "Of course you did. Rebuilding from the ashes." The very next morning, Naomi stepped into the cafe not as an employee, but as the owner. It felt strange. She had spent years behind this counter, taking orders, scrubbing tables, following the rules. But now, she was the one making the rules. She ran her fingers along the counter, taking in every inch of the space that once felt like a prison. Now it felt like home. Killian arrived not long after, dressed in casual clothes, blending in like he wasn't one of the most famous footballers in the world. They sat together, going over the renovation plans he had already set in motion. "I want this place to be more than just a cafe," Naomi said, excitement creeping into her voice. "I want it to be a place where no one gets turned away, whether they can afford a meal or not." Killian grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Why?" He pulled out his phone, showing her a list of donations. Her jaw dropped. Big names? Companies. Even some of Killian's own teammates had donated to support the new cafe. "You're kidding," she breathed. Killian shrugged. "They believe in what we're doing." Naomi felt a fresh wave of emotion hit her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever felt invisible. The grand reopening. 1 month later, Le Cœur Ouvert, the open heart, was officially reborn. The walls had been repainted. The furniture had been upgraded. A brand new sign hung above the entrance, replacing the cold corporate lettering that once existed. But the biggest change? The kindness wall. A simple chalkboard hung beside the entrance, where customers could prepay for meals for those in need. Each meal was represented by a small ticket, pinned to the board, ready to be taken by anyone who needed it. No judgment. No questions. Just kindness. Killian stood beside Naomi as a small crowd gathered for the reopening ceremony. Reporters. Local residents. Even some of Killian's teammates had come to support her. Naomi took a deep breath as she stood in front of them. For the first time, she wasn't just another worker in the background. She was the reason they were here. She glanced at Killian, who nodded encouragingly. She turned back to the crowd, gripping the ceremonial ribbon in her hands. And with one clean cut, Le Cœur Ouvert was officially open. The crowd erupted into cheers. Tears burned in Naomi's eyes as she watched people step inside, filling the cafe with laughter and warmth. But the moment that truly broke her? A young boy walked in hesitantly, his clothes slightly worn, his sneakers scuffed. He stopped at the kindness wall, scanning the board. Then, slowly, he reached up and took a meal ticket. Naomi covered her mouth, emotion crashing over her, because she knew that feeling. And now, no child would ever have to feel it again. Killian placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he murmured. Naomi turned to him, smiling through her tears. "No," she said softly. "We did. A cafe with a purpose." The reopening of Le Cœur Ouvert wasn't just another business launch. It was a statement. A message to everyone who had ever been overlooked, ignored, or told they weren't worth a second chance. Naomi walked through the cafe, her fingers brushing against the counter she had once worked behind. This time she wasn't taking orders. She was making the decisions. The cafe was busier than it had ever been. People weren't just coming for the food. They were coming for the story. The waitress who had once been fired was now the owner. Killian watched from the side, a proud smile on his face. He had seen many victories in his life, trophies, championships, record-breaking goals, but this was something different, something bigger than both of them. Naomi approached him, exhaling sharply. "I can't believe this is real." Killian chuckled. "You better believe it, because this is just the beginning." She glanced around the cafe, watching customers interact with the kindness wall, pinning up tickets for those who needed a free meal. The impact was already spreading, and she was determined to take it even further. An unexpected return. A few weeks later, Naomi was closing up the cafe late one evening when the door creaked open. She looked up, expecting a customer who had lost track of time, but when she saw who it was, her breath caught in her throat. Mr. Lambert. The man who had fired her. The man who had told her she was worth nothing. She stiffened. It had been years since she had last seen him. His hair was thinner, his posture less confident. He no longer had the commanding presence of a man who controlled everything around him. Now he just looked tired. He stepped inside slowly, his eyes scanning the cafe, taking in the changes. Naomi folded her arms, keeping her tone steady. "What do you want?" Lambert let out a small chuckle, though it lacked his usual arrogance. "You really did it, huh?" She didn't answer. Didn't need to. The success of Le Coeur Ouvert spoke for itself. Lambert let out a slow breath. "Look, Naomi, He hesitated, then shook his head. "I came to say I was wrong." Naomi's stomach twisted. She had spent years replaying that moment, the moment she was fired, the humiliation, the struggle that followed. And now, he wanted to admit he was wrong? A part of her wanted to lash out, to tell him exactly how much pain he had caused. But another part of her didn't care anymore. She had already won. She had built something far greater than he ever could. And she wasn't about to let his presence take away from that. So instead, she just nodded. "That's good to hear," she said simply. Lambert opened his mouth as if to say more, but then stopped. Maybe he realized there was nothing left to say. After a long pause, he nodded once and turned to leave. Naomi watched him go, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. Because she didn't need revenge. She had already gotten everything she needed. Word spreads worldwide. Naomi thought the cafe's story would remain a local success. She was wrong. Within months, Le Coeur Ouvert was making international headlines. Articles were written about how a fired waitress turned an act of kindness into a thriving business. People from all over the world donated to the cafe's mission. And then, the calls started coming. A journalist from BBC wanted an exclusive interview. A Parisian magazine wanted to feature her on the cover. And then came the most shocking call of all. The UNESCO Foundation invited Naomi to speak at an event about how small acts of kindness can change lives. Naomi nearly dropped the phone when she heard the request. This must be a mistake," she stammered. "No mistake," the woman on the other end said. "Your cafe has started something incredible. We want the world to hear about it." Naomi was stunned. For years, she had been an invisible worker. Now she was being asked to speak to world leaders. She sat in silence for a moment before finally whispering, "Yes, Killian's greatest assist." A few days before Naomi was set to leave for the UNESCO event, she and Killian sat outside the cafe, sipping coffee in the early morning light. The city was just waking up, but Le Coeur Ouvert was already alive with activity. Naomi exhaled slowly. "I don't know if I can do this." Killian raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She turned to him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "I'm not a public speaker, I'm just me." Killian smirked. "Exactly." She rolled her eyes. "That's not helping." His expression softened. "Naomi, you changed my life with a single meal, and now you're changing the lives of thousands. Just go up there and tell them the truth. That's all you need to do." She let out a slow breath, his confidence grounding her. "You're really not going to let me doubt myself, huh?" she muttered. Killian grinned. "Nope. Door tight. She laughed. Fine, but if I mess this up, you're buying me dinner. Killian smirked. Deal. The speech that changed everything. Naomi stood backstage, her hands shaking. The room beyond was filled with politicians, journalists, and some of the most powerful voices in the world. How did she end up here? She took a deep breath as her name was announced. She stepped onto the stage. The lights were blinding. The audience stared. Her heart pounded. But then she saw Killian, sitting in the front row, smiling. And just like that, she remembered. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here because she had a story to tell. Taking a deep breath, she began. My name is Naomi, and I was fired for giving food to a hungry boy. The room fell silent. And Naomi, she kept going. She told them everything. The struggle, the rejection, the night she lost everything. And then, the night she got it all back. She spoke about le cœur ouvert, about the kindness wall, about the people who walked in every day needing hope. She spoke about Killian, about the boy who had come back to change her life. And by the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. When she stepped away from the podium, the crowd erupted into applause. Killian was the first to stand. And as Naomi met his eyes, she realized something. This wasn't just his greatest assist. This was hers, too. Because kindness changes everything. A standing ovation that echoed across the world. As Naomi stepped off the stage, the applause thundered through the grand hall. The sound rushed over her like a wave, overwhelming in the best way possible. She had walked onto that stage as the waitress who had been fired for showing kindness. But she was walking off it as something else entirely. A voice for the unheard. A symbol of resilience. A woman who had turned one act of kindness into a movement that was now shaking the world. Killian was the first to reach her backstage. The second she saw him, she let out a shaky breath. Did I do okay? Killian laughed, his expression full of pride. You just made half the room cry, he teased. So yeah, I'd say you did okay. Naomi chuckled through the emotion clogging her throat. She had never felt so seen. Not as someone struggling to make ends meet, not as a worker in the background, but as someone who mattered. And the world? They were listening. A ripple effect. Naomi thought her speech would simply be a moment. Something powerful, yes, but fleeting. She had no idea what was coming. Within days, the video of her speech went viral. News outlets picked up her story, spreading it across continents. Celebrities started publicly supporting the Kindness Wall initiative, with some even creating their own versions in restaurants across different countries. In Brazil, a cafe launched the Mbappé meal program, where any struggling athlete could get a meal for free. In London, a chain of bakeries started offering prepaid loaves of bread for homeless communities. In the U.S., a famous restaurant chain announced a nationwide pay-it-forward meal initiative inspired by Naomi's Cafe. It was unstoppable. What started as one meal given to a hungry boy had snowballed into a global movement. And Naomi? She could barely keep up. One afternoon, while checking her emails, she nearly dropped her phone. She had been invited to meet with the president of France. Killian, sitting across from her at the cafe, noticed her stunned expression. What? He asked. Naomi slowly looked up. I just got invited to the Élysée Palace. Killian's eyes widened. He grinned. Well, that's a first. A waitress getting called to meet the president. Naomi shook her head in disbelief. No, she corrected softly. A restaurant owner. A meeting that changed everything. Naomi had never been inside the Élysée Palace. She had walked past it before during her time in Paris, always thinking it was a place for powerful people. Not for people like her. Yet, here she was. As she was led into a meeting room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was dreaming. And then, President Emmanuel Macron walked in. He shook her hand, offering a warm smile. Naomi, he said, it's an honor to meet you. She nearly laughed. The president of France was saying that to her? They sat down and the conversation began. Macron didn't waste time. Your cafe has inspired something incredible, he said, and we want to support it. Naomi's heart pounded. He continued, we're proposing a new initiative, one that funds cafes and restaurants willing to implement pay-it-forward meal systems like yours. The government will provide grants to support businesses that want to help their communities. Naomi couldn't believe it. This wasn't just about her cafe anymore. This was about changing the way businesses saw those in need. She swallowed hard, emotion thick in her throat. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Macron smiled. Just keep doing what you're doing, he said. And let us help. Naomi left the meeting shaken, overwhelmed, but determined. She wasn't just a part of something big anymore. She had helped create it. A legacy bigger than football. The months that followed were a whirlwind. Killian continued to support Le Coeur Ouvert, showing up whenever he could, sometimes surprising customers by working behind the counter. People from around the world traveled just to visit the cafe, leaving behind messages on the kindness wall. The French government officially rolled out the Pay It Forward initiative, funding dozens of businesses across the country that wanted to join the movement. And Naomi? She never stopped. She expanded the cafe, opening a second location in Marseille, her hometown, so that struggling families there could also benefit. She spoke at events, telling her story again and again, reminding the world that kindness wasn't just a nice idea. It was a responsibility. And Killian, he never took credit. Whenever he was asked about it, he'd simply say, Naomi is the real star of this story. But Naomi knew the truth. She may have built Le Coeur Ouvert, but it wouldn't have happened without him. And one evening, as they sat outside the cafe after closing, she turned to him with a small smile. I still owe you dinner, she teased. Killian chuckled. You don't owe me anything. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Not even a free meal? Killian smirked. All right, fine. But only if you let me pay it forward. Naomi laughed, shaking her head. She looked up at the Parisian sky, feeling lighter than she had in years. She had once lost everything. Now, she had built something that would outlive both of them. Some victories aren't about winning. Some victories are about making sure no one is left behind. And this was the greatest victory of all. A cafe that changed the world. As the weeks turned into months, Le Coeur Ouvert became more than just a cafe. It became a movement. The kindness wall was no longer just a small section of the cafe. It had grown into an entire wall, covered in meal tickets, each one representing a stranger's generosity. People from different cities, even different countries, had started coming in just to add their own contributions. Some even left letters, thanking Naomi and Killian for inspiring them to start similar initiatives in their own hometowns. And Naomi, she never stopped being in awe of it all. She would often stand behind the counter, watching the way people helped each other, and she would feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She had once thought the world was cruel, that people only looked out for themselves. But now she knew better, because kindness wasn't rare. It just needed a place to grow. A final surprise. One evening, just as Naomi was locking up the cafe, Killian walked in, carrying a small envelope. She smirked, arms crossed. You know, for someone as famous as you spend way too much time here. Killian grinned. What can I say? Best food in Paris. Naomi chuckled, shaking her head. What's that? She nodded toward the envelope. Killian hesitated, and for the first time he actually looked nervous. Naomi raised an eyebrow. That bad? He exhaled. No, just something I've been thinking about for a long time. He handed her the envelope. She slowly opened it, her eyes scanning the papers inside. Then her heart stopped. It was a deed. To the cafe. Her cafe. Her hands trembled as she looked up at Killian. You? Killian smiled. I'm signing it over to you, completely. No strings attached. This place should be yours, Naomi. Tears immediately welled in her eyes. She shook her head. Killian, This was your investment. This was always about you, he interrupted gently. I just helped open the door. But this is yours now. Naomi covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Because this wasn't just a business. This was her home. And now, it would be hers forever. Killian smiled. So, do you accept? Naomi let out a shaky laugh through her tears. She grabbed the papers, hugging them to her chest like they were the most precious thing in the world. Then, she looked him in the eyes. Yes, the legacy of Le Coeur Ouvert. Years passed. The cafe continued to grow, expanding into new locations, new cities, new countries. Naomi never forgot where it all started. She made sure that every cafe carried the same core values. No one gets turned away, and kindness is always free. Killian continued to be a silent supporter, showing up whenever he could, always reminding her that none of this would have happened without her. One day, long after the cafe had become a worldwide success, a journalist sat down with Naomi for an interview. They asked her, if you could go back to that night, the night you got fired, would you change anything? Naomi smiled softly. No, she said, because if I hadn't been fired, I never would have built something better. Some stories aren't about revenge. Some stories aren't about money. Some stories are about kindness and how it can change the world.